Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Mustafa. I'm a clinical faculty member at SI. This is my 5th year here. I am presenting research that I've been working with colleagues in Pakistan, and I'll be sharing who they are and their contributions as we go along. Even though my particular area of focus is conservative, patriarchal, and low-income societies, the work that I'm presenting looks into toxic masculinity, misogyny, patriarchy, which are experienced globally. The contours vary by country, but we face them here in the US. This image is from yesterday. For those of you who know me, I'm an avid Manchester United fan. I've been following them for 20 plus years now. United were playing Crystal Palace, lower ranked team. They were 2-0 up. They were comfortably winning. And then a brawl started, and you see Casemiro having his hands on Hughes's neck. I don't get why a professional footballer who's paid millions cannot keep his emotions in check and has to resort to physical means to resolve a conflict. Casemiro ended up getting a red card for violent conduct. He's not going to play the next 3 games. He's a valuable midfielder for United, which really sucks. But the larger point I'm trying to make is toxic masculinity, misogyny, patriarchy are experienced everywhere. I was at the hockey game on Friday. There was a number of brawls there. Michigan won 6-1, which is great, but we also had players sent off for violent conduct there as well. So just to give you a background on my motivation for doing this kind of work, Pakistan lags in terms of its maternal health and infant health. In terms of maternal mortality rate, about 140 women lose their lives while giving birth out of 100,000. Compared to high-income countries, that's about 13 times as much. Although Pakistan does slightly better than South Asia, I do want to say the South Asian average is increased because Afghanistan is at about 650 women per 100,000, and so it skews the average up. Is the font okay? Are you guys able to see in the back? Yeah, sounds good. And so Pakistan is also a fairly conservative country. It ranks 148 out of 149 in terms of the Global Gender Gap Index. Women oftentimes, when they get married, will move in with their in-laws and live with their husband's family. They have limits to their freedom of movement or who they're able to see. In terms of contacts with their loved ones, such as their parents or their siblings, they're having to go those are mediated by their husband or their in-laws. 28% of women in Pakistan aged 15 to 49 report some sort of physical abuse since the ages of 15. This is very similar for the rest of Asia as well. So India's at about 29%. My hunch is that this is an underreported number. The actual onset is much worse. Given the sensitivity of the topic. Violence does go down when a woman is pregnant. It goes down to 7% for Pakistan, physical violence, that is, and it goes down to about 3% for India. I'm not sure about emotional or verbal abuse. If you look at the strongest risk factors for women within a Pakistani context when it comes to mental health issues such as depression and anxiety, they are physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, very early marriages, hostile in-laws, and not having a trusting relationship with their husband. So if there's one thing I want you guys to walk away from this talk is that if you want to improve women's lives in patriarchal countries, in the medium to long term, you have to design technologies to help men become better partners. And I'm going to share strategies as to how to go about doing that and give an example of a case study that colleagues of mine and I've been working on over the last 6 odd years. And so there's a rich body of work in human-computer interaction and ICTD on improving women's health and well-being in South Asia. The first paper I'm going to cite is by Amna, who's here. Amna did this research in her master's thesis. I really hope I don't falsely cite her work, given that she's here. Amna designed a system that would send health reminders to expectant women that she recruited from a tertiary care hospital in Lahore. And one of the things that she found was that any kind of health messaging, whether it's through SMS only or through robocalls or SMS and robocall, increase health knowledge by about 13 points on a 31-point scale. But one of the things that Amna and Kentaro and others found in their work was also that the impact of any kind of health informatics intervention is mediated by family dynamics, often involving fathers and mother-in-laws, and what kind of dynamics they look like, I'll explain in the next slide. Now, one of the things that came up in Mariam Mustafa's work with religion is that religion and healthcare often get conflated in countries, especially in Islamic countries. And Mariam's done a 3-country study with other countries like Malaysia as well. And one example that they cite in their work is that the mother-in-law chooses to take the daughter-in-law who's pregnant for religious therapy, and religious therapy often involves going to individuals called peers. These are aged folks who are religiously inclined. It can be a man or a woman, and they read Islamic verses and will recite Islamic verses on water or jaggery or those kinds of things. You're supposed to eat that, and supposedly makes health outcomes better. Oftentimes, they'll treat women who've had miscarriages with such religious therapy as well. So women often will have limited agency as to what goes on with their bodies. That is not to say that women don't fight back or push back. One of the Western feminism has been criticized by South Asian feminism for looking at women in South Asia as powerless beings. And so oftentimes they will have microacts of pushback. One example that Mariam cites in her work is where a woman wanted to go shopping with her friends, but she didn't want to tell her mother-in-law. So she told her mother-in-law she was going to the health center, then went to the health center and told the lady health worker, if my mother-in-law asks, let her know I was here. And then when the lady health worker visited her home, her mother-in-law did in fact check, and the community health worker lied on her behalf. So microacts of resistance. The other thing that folks in HCI have unfortunately come to terms with is that if you're working within the patriarchy, if you're working in women's health in patriarchal countries, you kind of have to work with the patriarchy. And so Neha Kumar et al. Designed this platform called Projecting Health. It was a community-led video education platform to disseminate information in the form of videos to new and expecting mothers so that they are better equipped to care for their baby's health. In order to work with patriarchy, they extended their focus beyond pregnant or new mothers to also include mother-in-laws and fathers in their design. And so here's a quote from their paper. We learned that when Geeta, who was pregnant, and her mother-in-law saw the film on danger signs in pregnancy, the family arranged for emergency transportation. When Geeta went into labor, my hunch is if only Geeta had watched this video and tried to convince her mother-in-law or her husband, odds are that the outcome might have been a little different. In terms of, there's also this growing realization that patriarchy is here to stay. I don't expect that patriarchy is going to go away in my lifetime. And so there's some amount of resignation that if you're designing interventions specifically for women, you have to adopt an approach that considers the needs of all stakeholders and design something that's acceptable to all. One example that Sultana et al. Given a paper called titled Design Within the Patriarchy, which won a Best Paper Award at CHI in 2018. They cite a strategies that says, for example, package materials that empower women, educational content with information that will be approved by their husbands or in-laws. For example, information on cooking or raising children. Personally, for me, I think women in these contexts face very dire issues. And so, yes, we have to design for them. And yes, unfortunately, we have to come to terms with patriarchy and design with the patriarchy. But I do think if you want to improve women's lives and women's health in the medium to long term, we have to design for men to be better partners. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. That's not a new concept. It goes back to the United Nations Conference on Population and Development back in 1994, where they realized engaging male partners in sexual and reproductive health is important. Oftentimes, they're key decision makers in terms of women's health. The Super Abu team did this survey with 199 husband-wife pairs. This research was led by my colleague Sasha Ahmed, who's a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And one thing that we found was between 81 and 85% of the men reported making decisions. So 81% of men reported that they had a say in determining whether their wives got a tetanus vaccination when they were pregnant or not. 85% reported that they had a say in their wife's general health care. But if you look at the actual awareness when it comes to maternal health, only 56% sought any kind of information about maternal health. And out of these 199 men that we surveyed, they averaged about 7.4 in terms of maternal health on a 13-point scale on the 13 questions that we asked them. And so they're unfortunately the decision makers, and they happen to not know a lot of information about the decisions that they're making. Research has shown that engaging men in sexual and reproductive health helps with the female use of contraceptives, increases access to safe abortion care, and positively impacts mother, child, as well as the newborn. And if men's engagement is done sensitively through gender transformative programming in maternal, and MNCH is an acronym for maternal, neonatal, and child health. Apologies for the acronym. If it's done sensitively, then you can start to have make advances in terms of gender equality, in terms of men helping with house care needs or taking their wives to the health center themselves. To the best of, so even though there is research that shows involving male partners is important, a lot of this research is in the Western context. There's very limited research in South Asia. And to the best of my knowledge, none of this research, HCI, the human, in terms of technology design, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any technologies that are particularly designed for men to improve the lives of women's health. So the idea behind Super Abu or Super Dad came up in a design workshop that I helped organize in 2016 called IDDS, or International Development Design Summit. 5 participants whose names are here came up with the idea to connect expectant fathers to doctors. And so one of the things that they uncovered was that fathers are currently not part of the conversation around maternal care. So even if a husband wanted to show care and went with his wife to the hospital, for example, they're not allowed in OBGYN wards, for example. So they're sitting outside on the on the garden outside while the women go inside. And so there's this gap where there are many reasons for this. Culturally, this has always been what's considered women's business. There's social discomfort with this topic, and there's little access to gynecologists. And so oftentimes an OBGYN ward will not have privacy between a doctor and a patient. There's many women in the same ward. And so having men there feels discomfortable to a lot of the other women. And so one of the things that this team found was that there's this opportunity. Men wanted to be involved, but didn't have avenues to be involved. And so they came up with this idea to create a speech-based hotline to connect men to doctors. This was a two-week co-design summit. And so post-IDDS, Sasha, my colleague, Aghali Raza, who's a professor at LUMS and has done his PhD from Carnegie Mellon in language technologies. And I started working on Super Abu to take this idea to fruition. And so our approach is to design a speech-based platform. Why speech? About 2.9 billion people still lack access to the internet right now. And about 1 billion of them are low income, are low literate or functionally illiterate. And so when you're designing a platform for this population who either don't have access to computing technologies, or even if they do, won't know how to use them, an interface as simple as a phone call works really well. And so we created an interactive voice response platform where the interface, the front end, was as simple as a phone call. And I'll explain that in a minute. And the hope was to connect these expectant fathers to doctors to answer their questions. And you could ask questions privately, or you could ask publicly, such that the doctor's responses would be communicated onto the platform. And you could also share stories about childbirth with other men in order to hopefully create behavior change. And so this is what the front end looks like. As I mentioned, the front end is fairly simplistic. So you call this number and you hang up, and the system calls you back. And the reason for that is that incoming calls in Pakistan are free. And so when you call and flash the number and call back, you're not paying a penny for this service. But once you get a call back, it says, welcome to Super Abu. Press 1 to ask a question from a doctor. Press 2 to listen to doctors' responses to other people's questions. Press 3 to share your story, health-related story with other fathers. press 4 to listen to other people's stories. And so once you go into that menu, let's say you ask a question, it says press 1 for a private question, press 2 for a public question, and then there you have it. You're asking a question directly from a doctor. It's asynchronous, so you're not talking to a doctor directly. You're just recording an audio file that will eventually go to a doctor, and you'll get a response within 2 days. So we guarantee a 48-hour response. And then as you're listening to other people, responses to other people's questions, there's a social element here as well. So you can press 1 to upvote, 2 to comment, 3 to share, those kinds of things. So we've added some social components onto a very basic feature phone enabled speech platform. I'm going to pause here for a second. If I'm speaking too fast, and I've taught in 6 countries, the universal symbol to slow me down is this. And so let me know. And I saw some nods, so I will slow down. The other thing is, do you have any questions about the front end of the interface? Does this seem fairly clear? The platform. The platform was designed in Urdu, which is the national language of Pakistan. So all of the prompts are in Urdu. The doctors respond in Urdu, and the moderators, and I'm going to speak about the moderators in a second, also only now to speak Urdu. We did get about 5 to 10% of the audios in another language that we didn't understand. So there's a lot of native languages, regional languages. And so we're now deploying Super Abu in Pashto, which is one of the regional languages. And I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk as well. Thank you for that. So the backend is somewhat complicated, so I'm going to walk through it slowly, and hopefully I do a decent job. Once you place a phone call and let's say you record a question for a doctor, it goes onto our VoIP-based telephony server, and it's hosted there. So the server has a lot of memory, and then the server is connected to a web-based dashboard. And on this dashboard, you're able to see these audio files show up one after the other in near real time. Our moderators are working around the clock. So we have moderators that work in 8-hour shifts, and there are 3 shifts. So we have moderators working at night as well. All the content that goes onto the platform is pre-moderated ahead of time. So no content is allowed because we were worried about health misinformation. And then when a moderator listens to an audio file, they have 2 or 3 tasks that they have to do. One is they determine whether this is an appropriate content or not. Sometimes we get inappropriate content or misinformation, or there's just noise, or it's silence on the other side. If it's a real question for a doctor, then they determine which doctor the question needs to go to. And we have a panel of 3 doctors. We have a gynecologist or an OBGYN. We have a general practitioner or a family medicine person, and we have a pediatrician. And so once they route an audio file to a doctor, we have an Android app for the doctors, and the doctors get a notification on their app, and they're able to go in and hear the audio file. And doctors are busy, and so they can respond in 2 ways. They can type something back quickly, like a chat message on WhatsApp, for example, or they can record an audio file and respond back, and the response is going to go back onto the web-based dashboard. In terms of the backend users, as I mentioned, we have moderators who are moderating every content. We have these doctors. And then the third person that we have, which I personally find really fascinating, we created this fake persona called Dr. Saba. And the idea is when doctors were responding back to us, there was noise in the background in the hospitals, their audio wasn't clear. We created a persona, and we hired a speech artist who would re-record every response from a doctor. And so when you call the platform, you're talking to Dr. Saba. So everybody assumes that they're talking to this middle-aged gynecologist, and they're asking questions from her, even though our panel of doctors also happens to have male doctors. They're assuming they're talking to a female doctor. So Dr. Saba re-records the doctor's response. It goes onto the platform. It's a public question. If it's a private question, it only goes onto your profile. So the next time you call back, you can hear the doctor's answer, or you get a robocall out as well, depending on your preferences. Oh. I will get to that towards the end. It was largely religious reasons. There's an Islamic concept called parda that I'm going to explain towards the end. We did do some survey. We did a small RCT, and we found that male respondents found male responses more credible than female responses. Even then, we chose to go with a female voice, and I'll talk about the pros and cons that went into that decision in a bit. So we did this pilot. The first pilot for Super Abu was back in 2018. We launched this service, and over 71 days, the platform kind of exploded. We advertised on a lot of different platforms. We got about 21,000 unique cell phone numbers calling in, about 32,000 calls, and about 400,000 minutes were spent on the platform. We have two kinds of users. One is a proactive user who would ask a question or share a story. There's a lot of lurkers, for the lack of a better word, reactive users or some other user that largely just call in to listen to other responses, doctors' responses to other people's questions, or sharing, listening to other people's stories, and at best they'll just click like or something like that. But they're the ones who are spending the most time on the platform, and they're learning from responses as well. So I've been working with these three wonderful undergraduate students from Pakistan. They're seniors at a university in Lahore, alums, to go through this data. When we launched the platform, we had IRBs from all institutes where we had researchers present. When you call the service the first time, you're told that this is a research platform and your behavior is monitored for research purposes. Anytime you ask a question or share a story, when you press 1 to ask a question, you're reminded again that this is a research platform and you're consenting to being researched. So there's a dual informed consent that happens. And then the cell phone numbers are stored in a separate server than all of the questions. And so at the point of impact, they're separated. So only the PIs have access to cell phone numbers. Nobody else does. And a unique ID is assigned to every cell phone number. We had a large body of data, and so we went through this data, and there were some audio files that were marked as questions but were empty, or had something like, the service is great, thank you so much. So when we were trying to analyze this data, we created a voice filter, and anything that was less than 10 seconds of audio content, even though it's a 90-second audio file or something, we did not analyze that. And so we had about 3341 files that we were analyzing. We had 3 coders go through it and deductively code using a code book of 14 tags. And then we had an inductive coding between the 4 of us, and we came up with 45 codes, and I'm going to be presenting the findings here. This table on the right outlines the category of questions that we were getting that were tagged under maternal, neonatal, and child health, so MNCH, pregnancy issues, conception, maternal health, child health, children's illnesses. So child health is more infant's health, and children's illnesses is even if your child's like 5, 7, whatever have you. And so here's our 3 main findings. One is that we found that men were knowledgeable about their wife's health. This could be a sub-selected sample, but they were knowledgeable and they were concerned about their wife's health. Here's an audio, here's a transcript of an audio file. Assalamu alaikum, or may peace be upon you. My wife is pregnant. She's in her 8th month and has a blood deficiency. Her body becomes very stiff, especially at night. When she's sleeping or lying in bed, she can't move her legs as they become stiff. She also feels dizzy, has low blood pressure. I'm very worried. I'll be grateful if you can give us any advice as to what to do. Similarly, what we found was that the partners were expressing care. And so they're wanting to find, I've changed the name here, but my name is Faisal. My question is, what kind of precautions do I need to take as my partner is pregnant? And what does the husband need to do to take care of his wife such that the child's health is guaranteed? I will be waiting for your response. And the third is just any general questions that somebody like you or I would have around what's normal, what's not normal. My wife's throwing up, she's 3 months pregnant. Is this morning sickness normal or not? And so these are the kinds of questions that we were seeing. Oftentimes, these men don't have access to the internet. They don't have access to doctors. And so a lot of the questions are fairly basic as well, because the baseline level of maternal health knowledge is pretty minimal. The second key finding that we have is that if I were giving this talk in Pakistan and I presented finding number 2 in Lahore, for example, nobody would believe me. Because we found that men were comfortable talking about fairly sensitive and taboo topics on the platform. And so, for instance, I have 4 kids. My youngest daughter is 7 months old, and my wife is pregnant again. We don't know what to do as the youngest still feeds. Should we get an abortion? DNC is the medical term for an abortion. And if so, from where? And so abortion is legal in Pakistan, but it's like don't ask, don't tell. And so hospitals do perform it, but they would never advertise it. Most doctors would not perform an abortion after 120 days. But if you ever had an abortion, you would never share it even with your best friend, for example. And so we had people actively talking about abortion. We had folks talking about topics that would be considered shameful in that particular context, such as sexual dysfunction issues. This person, you could visibly tell that this person was uncomfortable as they were recording this audio note. They paused in the middle, they were mumbling at one point. They're talking about having a hard time with having an erection or premature ejaculation. And so they're wanting to figure out what is it that they need to do in order to satisfy their partner, and they're feeling like they're letting their partner down. Similarly, we had questions that were considered taboo. We got a lot of backlash for this particular question's response when Dr. Sabah responded to this. And so in a country like Pakistan, pleasure during sex is still considered not talked about, and sex is largely for procreation. At least that's how you talk about it in public. And so this person asked this question about what, and these are fairly like, there's no sex ed in Pakistan. And so you won't be finding out this kind of information in 8th grade or 5th grade or whatever have you here. And so some fairly basic questions are being asked on the platform. And so when the response to this was a public question, and so when the response went out, we got a lot of hate mail. We got a lot of people who were really upset that this platform had become immoral, and we got a lot of abusive messages as well. And so one of the things that we decided was that if a particular question was asked that the moderators felt that this community of users would not be comfortable with talking about publicly, then we will mark it as private, even if it was marked as public by the user. And so most questions that were coming our way, like the previous question, for example, this was marked private by the user, and so never went onto the platform. This particular question did go onto the platform and got us into a fair bit of trouble. Any kind of previous sexual health hotlines have been closed in Pakistan because of public backlash. So we were trying to stay under the radar as well. And so that was an administrative decision that we made running the service. The third thing that we found was this prevalence of benign health misinformation. So a lot of health misinformation that we see on online platforms here in the US, for example, oftentimes is organized, and there's trolling behavior, for example. In our case, a lot of the health misinformation that we were seeing was things that are passed down through generations. These are folk remedies. They may not work, but they may not have a direct harmful impact. And so here's an example: taking a good diet of clarified butter, milk, and almonds can help prevent a C-section. And I'll talk about how we were starting to deal with misinformation later. But one of the things that's interesting is that this was one of the most popular stories on the platform, or most engaging stories, I should say, on the platform. It got 88 likes. So clearly, this folk remedy is resonating with some folks. It also got 51 dislikes. So a lot of people are saying, hang on, this isn't true, or we're not agreeing with this. And there's 11 people who went so far as to report this as something that needs to be taken down. The other thing that we found was a lot of people were coming onto the platform to ask this doctor that they had access to about folk remedies or about religious therapy and the validity of such approaches. So is it true if a woman eats dates before she's due, she's more likely to have a normal delivery? Or can certain Quranic verses be used as an alternative to medical treatment and medication? And so even when we're talking about religion, for example, so this is marked as public by the user. But if we're explicitly going to go out and say, hang on, you can't use religious therapy, we're trying to be careful not to ruffle some feathers, so we mark this as private. Sorry. Yeah, so okay. Clearly, I have a slide on discussion that I'm not seeing here. Okay, I'm gonna wing this slide because I accidentally deleted it. So there's three main points that I want to discuss. One is that if you design a platform that has physical distance, temporal distance, and anonymity and privacy, then even in a fairly conservative country like Pakistan, you can have people talk about fairly sensitive topics. And so these are questions that people would not feel comfortable asking their best friend of the same gender. These are questions that people would not ask a doctor if they were talking to a doctor in person, male or female. And these are questions that people would not be comfortable asking a doctor in real time on a phone. And so the fact that the service is asynchronous, the fact that the service is anonymous and private, so nobody else gets to hear your question either, is probably the reason why we're seeing the kinds of sensitive questions that we're seeing on the platform. Paul?
A little bit. Mm-hmm. And I trust you that most people wouldn't talk about these things with their best friends until they're faster.
Right.
You have very good situation. Some people will talk about it on the hotline, but maybe these are very unusual people.
Quite possibly.
But also not their friends, but also that because of reasons you think that they're not.
Given how taboo sex ed is in Pakistan, even in very liberal circles, I've not seen any of this. And so it's, and I'm not going to chime in as the other Pakistani in the room, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but there's definitely a possibility that we have anomalous users, but let me go back to the table. Sorry. I want to say we had about 40 odd questions about sex ed. We had about 116 questions about conception. And a lot of the questions about conception were pretty PG around if you insert a penis this way, does this increase the chances of conception or those kinds of things. And so I don't think these are, like out of 936 questions that were asked, around maternal and child health, about 150 are questions that we would probably have to mark private. And so I think your pushback is well taken, and I need to dig into this more. But these are low-income users, these are low-literate users who also happen to be fairly conservative for the most part, in a country where this is not standard to begin with. What were my other 2 points? One is around health misinformation. And so one of the things that we started to do was if it was explicit misinformation, we would take it down from the platform, period. If it was harmful misinformation, we would take it down and we would record a response and we would send it back to the user saying, we've deleted your post, here's why. If it was benign misinformation, and if it's something that our moderators felt is also fairly commonly spread in society, we marked it as private. So nobody else had any access to it. But for your purposes, you never found out that this was misinformation and it wasn't taken down. And the reason why we made that call was oftentimes we'd get audios where 80% of it was factual and there was 20% folk remedies towards the end or something like that. And when you block people or you take their content down, for example, they get pissed off and then they don't have access to good health information, which would be valuable as well. So on a separate platform, we did a randomized control trial where we had 3 arms. One, and that study is publicly available. I can cite it for you. It was in my discussion file. We had one arm where it was called Sunshine is the Best Disinfectant. And so it was pre-moderated. The misinformation stayed on the platform. But before you heard the misinformation, you heard a moderator's or a doctor's response saying, the next audio file is misinformation, here's why, and then you heard that audio file. So we didn't take it down, but we responded to it, and you heard the response before you heard the file. So that was one arm. The second arm was, it was all pre-moderated, and any misinformation was taken down completely. And the third arm was where it wasn't pre-moderated, everything went onto the platform directly, and we had the community flag any kind of misinformation. So any kind of audio file that got 5 votes of misinformation, our moderators would look at it. If it was misinformation, they would take it down, but it wasn't pre-moderated. And one of the conclusions that we came to was working with 2 economists on that study, Armand Razai from UC Davis and Sarojini Hirschleifer from UC Riverside. One of the conclusions that we came to was that the pros and cons of pre-moderation are actually worse. So having option C, not pre-moderating anything, is better because the amount of health misinformation on our platform is very minimal. And even though our moderators were working around the clock, our turnaround rate for content, especially misinformation content, but otherwise as well, was about 7.5 hours, because they had to ask questions from doctors and stuff like that. And so when your audio file doesn't reach the platform immediately and you're not seeing any engagement with it, our users start to go away. And so when they leave the platform, they're not getting access to the good health information. And for a tiny amount of misinformation on the platform, we're turning them away. And so our conclusion in that study was pre-moderation is not the answer because the pros and cons don't add up. The third thing I wanted to talk about, I'll come back to it in a minute, but I'm going to take 5 minutes. I'm going to wrap up. I gave you an example of engaging men around women's health, particularly around pregnancy. Sorry, I found my third point. The third point is pregnancy is a key moment to make this intervention, because the interests of the husband, the mother-in-law, and the mother align. They all want a healthy birth. You're seeing a lot of concern for your wife's health because you're like, what do I need to do to get a healthy baby? And that concern may not be there if it wasn't for pregnancy. And so if you want to engage men, this is a nice place to get a hook, and then you can start to do broader work with them beyond this as well. And so one example of broader work is engaging men in child's health. A lot of my previous work before I came to SI was on immunization. We redesigned an immunization health card with text-free user interface design. What we found there was this was designed for mothers. Mothers were bringing their children to vaccination centers. But what we found there was anytime there was a vaccination rejection rate, a vaccination rejection case, and you ask the mother, why aren't you getting your child vaccinated? They would almost always say, my mother-in-law doesn't allow this, or my husband doesn't allow this. Go talk to my husband. And so we've just gotten a Gates grant to work in what are called super high-risk union councils, where vaccination rates are the highest. And so this past December, I was working in Peshawar, which is about 20 miles from Afghanistan, Pakistan borders Afghanistan on this side. Unfortunately, the militants are back in that province. We saw a suicide attack last week at a police academy mosque, and that killed 100 people last week. And so a lot of health workers get targeted by the Taliban because they think polio vaccine is a CIA ploy. And so a lot of health misinformation around vaccines is present. And so we're trying to do some behavioral interventions on the platform itself. So we're going to deploy Super Abu in Pashto and run behavioral change experiments on the platform to try to see if we can have any kind of change in perceptions around vaccines. So if anybody's done any kind of work in behavior change and health, please do talk to me afterwards. I'm working with a group of students in Pakistan on designing an anger management app with religion as its core focus. If I ask men to journal just generally, they think that's too bougie and it's Western. But if you can start to convince them that this is linked to the religion, and with Sufi Islam, there's a lot of focus on inward self-reflection and meditation, they might be able to use something like this. So we're trying to design an anger management app for men with a particular focus on men with religion at its core. We're also trying to figure out, I'm working with a student in India to try to see how can we engage men to be more emotionally vulnerable in front of other men. And so here's a screenshot of a closed Facebook page for women run by women called the Little Brown Diary. It's based in the US, and the idea is that this is for first and second generation South Asian women. It's a safe space for them to help each other out. And one of the things that you can see is that it has about 37,000 people on the platform. LBDs become so popular that there are Little Brown Diary variants. So there's LBD Muslim, and there's LBD Detroit, and LBD San Francisco. And so some of my friends who are on these safe spaces say they get about 50 or so posts a day or something like that. There's a lot of moderation. I've done a lot of work with little safe spaces. Some of these papers are public. Somebody tried to create a male equivalent of this called the Browntown Journal that says, based on the overwhelming success of Little Brown Diary, let's have something for brown men. There's about 690 people. I'm a member there. For the last year and a half, there's been like 3 posts. And so how can we convince men to be more vulnerable in front of other men and seek help? That's something that I'm wanting to work with somebody, a student in India. His name's Hamza. I'm also working on with some colleagues here in Ann Arbor on trauma healing with Afghan refugee men. And the idea is a lot of violence originates from untreated traumas. And so we're using alternatives to violence, an alternatives to violence approach, AVP, which was created in the 60s and 70s in upstate New York with prisoners, and it's been deployed in multiple places in many different refugee camps around the world and has been successful. And so we're trying to do this with Afghan men. And so we're doing this in Pashto and Dari, and we do these workshops on weekends here. So if you're trying to design for conservative, low-income, patriarchal men, here's some broad principles. Design for faith, religion, and spirituality sensibilities. So one example is there's a quote from Muhammad that says, if you're doing charity, do it in such silence that if you're giving with your right hand, your left hand doesn't find out. And there's a similar verse in Matthew, I think, in the Bible. And so here's an example. Like if you look at crowdsourcing, crowdfunding platforms here in the US, like GoFundMe, it's very public. You have to come disclose your need publicly. Over here, this friend of mine started this WhatsApp group called To Serve Humanity. He's added about 500 people on the platform that he knows personally or knows as a friend of a friend. And then people come to him and say, here's my need. So for example, a security guard got his bicycle snatched from him a few days ago. He's looking for 15,000 rupees. And if you want to respond to this, you can apply privately, and it goes to the moderator only. And then he comes back and says, case closed, Jazakallah khair for the prayers and contributions. May Allah shower his countless blessings to whoever helped and whoever had the intention to help. So nobody finds out who this was for, and nobody finds out who contributed any amount of money. And so this is a digital equivalent of putting that verse into action. So try to think about religious sensibilities when you're designing for such populations. Invest resources and think creatively about moderation. Talked about that. I'm not going to go into detail. I was listening to this talk by Richard Anderson from the University of Washington, and he was giving this talk on making good ideas last. And one of the things that he talked about was that any ICTD technology that's scaled and has lasted for the last 20 odd years had the presence of mind to think about the technology or build the technology when the technology wasn't ready yet. And so Gaetano Borriello, who passed away a few years ago to cancer, built Open Data Kit. And in 2008, he was saying, smartphones are going to be very prevalent in low-income countries. Let's create a data collection platform on smartphones. Everybody that he went to raise funding left him out of the room. And ODK has become so popular, it's in over 100 countries, gets used tens of thousands of times a day. And so the argument that I'm making is that speech technologies might not be ready yet, but they will be in 5 years' time. The speech synthesizer for Urdu was only created about 5 years ago. So text-to-speech was not possible in Urdu before 5 years. If you want to design for these communities, speech is the way to go. And it's going to take a while for the technology to get ready, but we need to start now. So I'll stop here, take any questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Back to that question of why you should. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot. So there's this concept in Islam called mahram. And the idea there is that if you're a woman, there's certain men that are your mahram. You're allowed to not cover your head, for example, around them. So there's your husband, your father, your brother, there's a list of men. Anything outside of that, there's certain things that you have to do. So even if you're talking about your wife's health, you're not allowed to talk to a strange man, even if they happen to be a doctor. And so even in medicine, for example, they allow you to decline care if you have a male OBGYN here, for example. A lot of Muslims from Dearborn, for instance, will insist on having a female OBGYN for that reason. And so it's questionable as if it's coming from religion or if it's coming from culture, but it's pervasive across the Muslim world in many different parts of the world. And so one of the things that we thought of was that we will not get any kinds of questions that are considered to not, and there's a concept of parda. The word parda literally means curtain. And so you're supposed to have a curtain from anybody who's not a mahram. So outside of these 6 to 8 men, anybody else, you have to have this curtain. And so you're not allowed to share sensitive things. And so this decision was made catering to the religious sensitivities of that particular audience. And okay.
One of Robin's questions was, one of your long-term goals seemed to be about changing men's behavior and attitudes. How do you think your study did that, or how do you know it increased their engagement in maternal health more broadly?
So that's a very good question. From this particular data set, we do not have data to show impact, but we have an NIH R21 grant to do a randomized control trial. Armand Razai is heading that RCT. We're going to recruit 1,600 couples in their first or second trimester. 800 families are going to have access to Super Abu, 800 families will not. We've done power calculations, and the idea there is to track them till 3 months after birth, and then try to see whether, and track certain healthcare metrics. So tetanus vaccination for the mother, the number of antenatal care visits, as well as birth outcomes, and see if there's any kind of change between those two. So we're in the process of doing an RCT, but we don't have data yet to show long-term healthcare changes, healthcare outcomes.
I feel like it's possible. How often, like, men were asking on behalf of themselves, or asking on behalf of their wives, or like, you know, like because they found me out and because that's the talk. Or like, do you have any sense of like, if you can read through these messages and what is it?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last 3 words? I didn't get it. It's hard to make a definitive statement, but I think there's a few things that are happening here. One is they're aware of their wife's health, whether it be pregnancy related or not, and so they're asking questions that sometimes they would know. So things like, when we're having sex, my wife has a lot of pain and we have to stop, and it happens every night. Can you help? That's something that you'd expect them to know. But they also happen to know a lot of health details about their wife, about other kinds of health issues that their wives are having, that unless they're communicating with each other, they would not have access to. How they choose to relay this information back is hard to say, but I'm guessing there's some sort of an open communication around these health topics that's happening in the household. We also had questions from women themselves, even though the platform was marketed to men. And so there were questions that women called and directly asked. Oftentimes they would ask privately because there's a lot of harassment on these platforms for women. And so there are services that exist for women. There's also offline services. So for instance, Pakistan has a very robust community healthcare worker program, which has 100,000 lady health workers that go door to door in rural areas. Jesse.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering about sort of what are the future directions for this platform, and if you're planning to develop it into something beyond the research study, and particularly if there are very other information that's being collected. There's at least 2 servers it looks like that have phone numbers and information. So I want to get it outside of the study stage and informed consent requirements and things like that. Is there any planning around that, and what question on that?
It's a good. Our users know we're collecting their cell phone numbers because we call them back, right? So they call and they hang up and we call them back. So they know that the server is collecting cell phone numbers, even if we weren't consenting them, even if we weren't telling them. The cell phone number is stored on a separate server, so you can't pair up what this person recorded or what audio they listened to with their unique identity. And so we destroy that connection at source. So if one of our servers gets hacked, you can get to see what questions were asked, but you can't see who asked them, or vice versa. You might get a lot of cell phone numbers, but you don't know what their activity looked like. So, all right, thanks so much. Thank you for your time.
Seeing you all there. Have a great day.
Thank you, Jeff.